everyone. Today I'm joined by Neil Emmanuel and Dr. Eleanor Janega, and we're going to be talking about their book, The Middle Ages, A Graphic History. This is a new book that's out now, absolutely fantastic, that incorporates text about the Middle Ages, but also some absolutely fantastic illustrations that Neil has done. But
Thank
first,
you.
Eleanor, could we maybe talk about the Middle Ages? What is the Middle Ages?
This is a great question, and one that I always like to be asked, because some people tend to think that the Middle Ages just means before Victorians, but it doesn't. The term Middle Ages kind of gives you a hint at what we mean by it, and we mean it's in the middle of the ancient period, which is most of history, and the modern period. And so we just, for the sake of it, say that the ancient period ends with the fall of Western Rome in 476, when the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, is deposed. So there you go. If it's 477, you are talking about the medieval period. And then what we mean by the end of the medieval period really varies from place to place and person to person. But as a general rule of thumb, if you are saying the year 15, you're talking about the early modern period. So 16th century onward, you are pretty fair to say that you're now early modern instead of medieval. So medieval is basically everything between those 2 points.
So we're basically looking at about 1,000 years worth of history, aren't we? From 476, 477 AD onwards, just after the Romans, all the way through Norman conquest, all the rest of it, all the way through up until about the 1500s.
Yep, that's absolutely right.
And is the medieval period the same as the Middle Ages?
Yes, it is. And so a lot of people get confused by that, but the terms are completely interchangeable. So say you're one of those people who has trouble spelling medieval, don't worry about it. You don't have to. You can just say Middle Ages. Everyone will know what you're talking about, and you'll be exactly right.
Fantastic. And what about also there's some other phrases that I think quite often confuse people because there's so many different phrases are used for the same kind of time. Dark Ages. Let's talk about the Dark Ages. What are the Dark Ages?
Yeah, so the Dark Ages, we have to be really particular with that, because when historians use the term Dark Ages, all we mean by that is the early medieval period. So, again, 476 up to, and I suppose here you could say a lot of the time a good one is Charlemagne, so around about the year 800 when we get the Carolingian Renaissance and we've got a lot more texts. I'm bringing texts up because the thing about the term Dark Ages is a lot of people tend to think that the Dark Ages is a term that we use to mean bad or like a really difficult time where terrible things were happening, but that's not what we mean. We mean dark as in occluded, and by occluded, I mean it's difficult to see what was going on because we don't have a lot of texts that survived. So it's just a period of time when we don't have a whole lot of people writing down what it is that they were experiencing. And that's completely understandable because it's a really, really long time ago. It's more than a millennium ago. And if you think about, for example, I always say it's like moving house. Like when you move house, you throw out all your old electricity bills, you throw out books that you aren't reading, you throw out all the papers that you don't need. Medieval people did that too. So it's only the biggest, brightest, most special texts that ever survive that long. And you can't expect everyone to just be keeping every single shopping list that they had from the time. So it doesn't mean bad. It just means that we're not exactly sure what's going on. And because of that confusion, we sort of stopped using the term Dark Ages. So from a historian point of view, now we tend to say early Middle Ages instead, just to kind of keep people on board with us and so that they know what we mean.
So the Dark Ages is the same as the early medieval period or the early Middle Ages. In archaeology, sometimes we also call that time post-Roman, the post-Roman period. But really, we're talking about that very late 400s going into the 500s AD, and then for the next 200-300 years. And then we come to the High Middle Ages.
That's right. And the High Middle Ages is a really, really interesting time. And actually, it's a point of time when a lot of us know a bit more. So the High Middle Ages is when a lot of the hits that you will know happen. So here in England, the Norman Conquest, the Crusades all happened during the High Middle period, although some of them are also happening in the late medieval period. It's fine. The first ones are in the High Middle Ages, but you also have the rise of universities. It's the beginning of medieval scholasticism. So we have a lot more thinkers who are writing a lot of philosophy, and it's when we really sort of cement what it means to be a medieval person. So you've got the rise of the church at this point in time, and all the structures that we really tend to think about in terms of medieval Europe are established at this time. So when we say high medieval Europe, what we mean by that is like, oh, it's really got going at this point.
And then I guess we move on in time to the late medieval period.
That's right. And now this is my time to shine because I'm a late medievalist more specifically. And the late medieval period is really interesting because this is kind of when things start to go wrong. So you have a number of really terrible things kind of happen in the late medieval period. So in the 14th century in particular, say from 1317, you've got the Great Famine that happens. After that, in 1335, you've got the Black Death is introduced to Europe. You have the Great Schism in the church, which is when there was one pope in Avignon and one pope in Rome and sometimes a pope in Pisa. So there's all kinds of really interesting big shifts that happen in the late medieval period. Oh, and the 100 Years' War, forgot about that one.
And we'll come to these in more detail in a bit because they're all mentioned in the book that we're going to talk about. But the late medieval period is 1300s onwards.
Yeah, roughly. Yeah, I would say so.
Up until about 1500s.
Yeah. That's a really good way of putting it. You know, it's one of these things where, you know, historians will argue about this all day long, but it's just because we're boring and insufferable. So that's, you know, a good rule of thumb is as good as anything else.
So the medieval period basically breaks down into three periods: the early medieval period, or the Dark Ages, or the early Anglo-Saxon period, or the post-Roman period. That's all the same. Then we got the High Middle Ages, or the mid-medieval period, and then we've got the late medieval period, or the late Middle Ages.
Yeah, we had to come up with high because mid-medieval period just sounds too awkward, you know.
Yeah.
And you managed to do that. So 1,000 years of history, and you managed to get that into a book this size. That's pretty amazing, actually.
It took some doing. I'll be honest with you there. What I ended up doing was I modeled it off of first year university courses that I teach. So my idea was I wanted people who had no idea about medieval history to be able to pick this up, and by the end of it, they'll have like a really solid basis of what the major structures of the medieval period are. What are the themes? What are the big things that change over time? But it had to be something where you could also pick it up and you'd want to do that, you know, because it can be kind of daunting. We don't all know about the medieval period. We're not all taught about it in school because it's really complex and messy. So you can't really sit an 8-year-old down and say, oh, and by the way, things are really different in Italy than they are in Bohemia than they are to England. So, you know, pay attention to that. But when we're adults and we can do this for fun, we can pick up a fun and easy book like this, learn a bit more, and we can be more comfortable with the fact that it's a little bit messy. So it's a really nice opportunity to talk to adults who want to learn a bit more, but who don't really feel the need to be very stuffy about it.
I think the fantastic thing is, as well as the text, is that there are some amazing illustrations as well, and which Neil, you were in charge of. That was your job, wasn't it?
Yeah.
How did you come about to be involved in doing this book?
So it was really kind of happenstance and a bit of like who I've been working with and the kind of works that I do. So finishing time team, working with directors who work on historical shows, asking me to do historical artwork and graphics, and I would like to generate my own artwork if possible, because that's what I'm interested in, really. And so getting a body of work together, which included woodcut and manuscripts, illuminations, that kind of style of thing, and also in parallel knowing people in the comics world in London and the UK. So a good friend, Wallace Eates, who manages Ladies Do Comics, she knew someone who was looking for a medieval cartoon comic illustrator, and so I guess I could fit that bill, and I eventually got in contact with Icon Books, and we ended up having a nice meeting. Met Eleanor, met Kira, who's our really lovely editor. And it kind of we went from there, didn't we, Eleanor?
Yeah, it was a very, for me, and if you build it, they will come sort of moment, because I never even questioned, hilariously, in retrospect, that I'd be able to find someone who would draw this for me. I just went off and started writing it. So by the time I luckily found Neil, I was about halfway through. That was a very, very good and nice thing for me, because he was really able to understand what it was that I was trying to put out there. And the entire process ended up being like just an absolute joy.
And your writing style as well is very digestible, so it really complements the nature of the book.
Aw.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, thank this. I'll hang out for all these compliments all day long. This is great.
It's true. I think it made it like also a very rich collaboration. You know, the way that we were able to kind of work together, and I would find lots of the like you're talking about all these different topics that everyone's kind of hearing you talk about. This is kind of what it was like for me. Illustrating the book, I was learning on the job. You know.
Neil, do you have a favourite illustration that you did?
Yeah, so I've got different favorites, I guess, for different reasons. So, like, I'm a big fan of the others page, where we're sort of talking about minority groups in the past, and then we've got minority groups today, and we're kind of like doing a little bit of a comparison. So I kind of like that topically, because I think that's kind of important. We have a nice section on others. Lots of like prostitution and all sorts of different kind of like homosexuality, and these are like really important topics today, I think, and learning about them in the past informs how we think about them now. There's also a nice page to do with Peter Abelard. So where I got to write again, like this kind of I got to put a little Easter egg there, and I got to do a little bit of poetry as well. So I embedded that in there, and it's a poem about Peter Abelard's Peter. So if anyone knows what that is, or go read the book. You read.
Yeah, you're gonna have to read the book to find out more about why we brought this up.
Yeah. Can we just briefly mention that? Who is Peter Abelard?
Peter Abelard was a high medieval philosopher and theologian. He was incredibly important, and he was one of the big names that was first attached to the University of Paris when it was set up. And he basically gets himself in a bit of trouble with the church, and more particular Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who is like a church favorite. Essentially, he's such a jerk that a bunch of his teachings get banned because he's just completely awful to other people. He's a really, really fascinating guy because he's absolutely brilliant, but a terrible person to be around, and that gets him in trouble. So it's interesting, the things that can get you into trouble or that you can get away with in the medieval period.
I mean, didn't he just go round into people's classrooms shouting at other teachers?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting because the medieval idea of a university is totally different to our own, and it's really focused on debate, and specifically debate about philosophy and theology. And so he would sort of be like, "Come on, class, we're going over to my rival's classroom," and he would walk in and start talking about how they were a complete idiot and how they were wrong about this. And it was like walking around with like a little gang of undergrads who would just sort of clap for you. So yeah, university not exactly the same. I mean, I can't imagine doing how well that would go down if I did that to any of my colleagues. And I don't think my students would really come along with it either, but at least I hope they would.
It was definitely an interesting character, and I think your illustration, Neil, your kind of cartoons there are fantastic of that. There's so many different sections. Obviously, you're covering 1,000 years of history, and I'm just wondering. Actually, I mean, there's a fantastic section on the Black Death. Now, I know that Eleanor, this is one of your favourite subjects. Maybe we could just talk a little bit about what the Black Death is. Was it called the Black Death then? What kind of time frame are we talking about? And maybe a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so the Black Death, it can be confusing because it is an outbreak of bubonic plague, and it's the largest outbreak of bubonic plague that had ever happened in Europe. But it's not the first, and it's certainly not the last. So we know, for example, it was around in the Justinian plague, in Byzantium, stuff like that. But basically, the germ Yersinia pestis, which is what causes bubonic plague, came off of some fleas that were on marmots out in kind of like the Tajikistan, Kazakhstan part of the steppes, when lots of caravans start going through the Silk Road because it's a really peaceful period of time. So people start trying to make money. And the fleas jump off the marmots onto the horses, the camels, the what have you, and onto people. It's a highly, highly communicable bacteria. So you kind of get it from fleas in the first instance, but if you're around anybody else, you get it as well. It makes its way over to Europe by 1335, and it just basically decimates everything. It comes off of the Crimean Peninsula into Constantinople and then into the Italian city-states. And from there, because the Italian city-states are such prodigious traders, it gets basically everywhere in Europe. Long and short of it, by the time the Black Death is done, 25% of the world's population are dead. And it didn't happen in the Americas and it didn't happen in Australia. So that kind of tells you, you know, it's only half the continents that are populated that got this, and it was 25%. So that means in places like really big, important cities like Florence, they lose 60% of the population. But when we're specifically talking about the Black Death, we mean that iteration of the plague. So the plague becomes endemic in Europe and Asia and Africa as well, and it will happen every few years. So, for example, here in London, we have a really bad outbreak of plague in 1666, but that's the 17th century plague. It's the same virus, but it's not the Black Death. So it's kind of like champagne. If it's champagne, if it's the Black Death, everything else, that's just sparkling death. Okay, so it's not the same thing. We mean one specific thing when we say it.
And it was called the Black Death, not at the time, but later, really, because it was just so horrible.
Exactly. So they called it the pestilence, and they would refer to it over and over again as the pestilence, and they would describe it. So, you know, we've got firsthand accounts. For example, Giovanni Boccaccio in the Decameron has a really good explanation of what all of the symptoms are and how it breaks out. And they just say pestilence over and over again. We say Black Death because of how extraordinarily awful it was. And it's funny because I just spent some time lecturing you about how the Dark Ages doesn't mean bad, but in this case, black does mean bad. So, you know, and funnily enough, Black Death and the Dark Ages absolutely nothing to do with each other. You know, about 900 years away from each other.
But it's interesting now, I think, given that, you know, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and, you know, it is awful. Many people, well, in fact, everyone's been affected by COVID in some way. But actually looking back at the Black Death, that time still must have been even worse than what we're going through now.
You know, it's interesting because it was so bad that it's still almost affecting us now. It was funny when COVID started breaking out, all of my media requests went through the roof, and everybody wanted to talk about the Black Death, because when we think about pandemics, just it's sort of hardwired into our psyche at this point in time that what you mean is the Black Death, because that's how awful it was. And I mean, imagine you lived in Florence and 60% of every single person you knew died. And, you know, here in England, we lose entire villages that just don't have a population to sustain them, and they're rewilded. We have rewilding across Europe where there just aren't enough people to keep farms going, so it becomes wilderness again. I think it's in Scandinavia, the population doesn't recover to pre-plague levels until about the 1700s. So this is a really substantial loss of life, and it's almost too large and terrible for us to really get our heads around, because we've never encountered anything that is anywhere near this. I mean, obviously COVID is horrible. It's changed all of our lives, and way, way, way too many people have died, but it is nowhere near the levels of what we're talking about in terms of the Black Death.
Yeah. And I think, it's really interesting that you cover that actually in one of your sections. But just looking at the 1300s in general, I mean, that was a crazy century. So not only have you got the Black Death going on, previous to that, there's a famine.
Yeah, the Great Famine. So it's funny because it's the Black Death and the Great Famine. The Great Famine makes it sound like it was good, and it wasn't. But we have the Great Famine comes along, and essentially we have a real change in weather in Europe. Previous to this, Europe was experiencing what we call the medieval warm period. So temperatures were just a bit warmer. It's a little bit less warm than now, but around about there. So it was really great for agriculture. In about 1317, this starts going away, and we enter what's called the Little Ice Age, which actually reigns for the majority of the early modern period as well. And in 1317 and the following years, we have absolutely terrible summers, and they're very cold, and it absolutely pours it down with rain. So basically, everywhere had a British summer across Europe for 2 years in a row. And crops completely collapsed as a result of this. And in the medieval period, it's not the same as now. You can't just say, okay, well, that's fine. We will get rice in from Australia instead, or we can get potatoes in from South America. I mean, not the least because we didn't even have potatoes yet. But it's one of these things where there was nowhere else to go. You had to get food in your own backyard. And when you couldn't do that, there was a huge famine as a result. And we have huge loss of life there as well. So it's a really terrible thing when you think about it, because it was almost like we were just about restabilizing here in Europe after the Great Famine hits. And then you've got the Black Death. So imagine living through the Great Famine in your 20s, and then you're in your 40s and the Black Death comes along. It's absolutely devastating as a series of events.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's quite a crazy century. And on top of that, you mentioned earlier, you've also got the 100 Years' War, which people can learn about in the book, and the Great Schism, which is the period where you end up with 3 popes, not 1, not 2, but 3 popes, and all sorts going on. So again, this is all really well explained in the book, and I just think it's fantastic because each one of these subjects, these individual subjects on their own, you could talk for hours about. You could write an entire book or thesis on, couldn't you?
Oh yes. Oh God. It's one of the things where it's very funny when you're trying to get through 1,000 years of history, and then you hit the 14th century, and it's, oh, how do I address all of these things where on their own, if you put any one of those things in a separate century, that would be the defining thing of the century, right? The Great Famine would be the defining feature of the 12th century if you popped it there, but that's not when it happened. They all just happen to happen at exactly the same time. So it's a sort of force of a century if what you're really into is tragedy.
But as you were saying, it's actually, from your perspective as a social historian, it's interesting. Would you like to explain why?
Yeah, so for me, the reason why the 14th century is interesting is because when you get a group of people and you put them in bad circumstances, that's when you find out who they really are. Right? Everyone's on their best behavior when everything's good. They don't have to worry. They don't have to, and they can just kind of get on with life. When things are really, really bad, that's when you find out who people are. It's the plot to any zombie movie, right? That's like you get to true natures very quickly. And so as a result of the Black Death and everybody dying, there's a lot of people who quite understandably think that this might be the end of the world, which you can't really fault them for. And the ways that people react to that are really different. Some people become like really pious, really aesthetic. They say, I'm putting myself on a diet and I'm wearing a hair shirt. People go even further than that. You have groups like the Flagellants who go from town to town, stripping themselves naked to the waist and beating themselves with ropes to try to appease God because they think that God sent this as punishment. And then you've got people who go in exactly the opposite direction, and they say, it's the equivalent of what I call it's like YOLO culture, where it's like, well, if I'm going to die tomorrow, I'm having a party now. And they are all making out with each other in the streets, drinking wine and having a great time, because that if they're going to go out, they're going to go out partying. So it's really interesting because we can tend to think about the Middle Ages and people in the Middle Ages as a complete monolith and say, well, this is, how people are. We say they're very religious, they're very uptight, they don't know how to have fun. And that's not true at all. Really religious people, certainly, but they still live their lives however it is they're going to live their lives. And you can still pick out a lot about people's personalities and the way that the world works for them within structures like a highly religious society.
That's really interesting. And people need to read the book to find out more about it. I'm just wondering, Neil, actually, can we talk a little bit more about your illustrations?
Sure.
Because what was your influence for these? They're very they're very striking. They're wonderful. What was your influence behind this?
So a lot of the style really comes from medieval manuscripts. I think actually, like Eleanor, I was like looking up illuminations, but then you said, "Well, Neil, use the word manuscript," and I could actually find lots of references. So manuscripts, illuminations, and woodcuts are my main influence, and that's sort of like I was saying before, it's a body of work that I'd already been working with. So I kind of already had quite a good handle with it. The front cover is a bit more like an painted illumination, whereas the internal work's kind of like a little bit like a hybrid woodcut. So because it's black and white book, wood cutting kind of style works, but having some sensibilities of how they do line work with manuscripts. And I actually do a lot of research. So like, I think I've mentioned this before. I did an interview with Tim, and I was just sort of saying about working with Victor Ambrose was quite interesting, because he had this big library of in his head of costumes and looks and periods, and he just really, you know, had this experience. Whereas for me, I kind of didn't have necessarily that. I have books about costumes and I have to go foraging, but actually, like, my best source material was just looking at different ways people illustrated in manuscripts, and I'd take certain elements and from here and there and glom them together, and so it was kind of a quite a Frankenstein sort of process, and it was important to, on the whole, try to make things as accurate. I didn't want loads of things in there that shouldn't be in for the right period, which again is quite hard to know, because you know, manuscripts have been spread over across 1,000 years. The earlier stuff looks a little bit different from the later stuff, and you see a bit more detail in the later stuff. So it's kind of just trying to get the right balance, and then but breaking those rules when we need to, in order to kind of maybe do a little bit of comedy or put in an anachronistic element in there. So like we're talking about with the Peter Abler, there's a picture of an inn or a pub, that kind of thing, and we called it the Drunken Monk because the monks are kind of being drunkenly loutish. But you know, there's obviously other more modern connotations of drunken monk, kind of kung fu. You know, like, so we're kind of like playing with like things like that as well to really kind of make it relevant and keep it interesting, and having elements dovetail and feedback. So like, you know, having a little kind of in there is a little Tony Robinson-esque character in there.
Oh, whereabouts?
It's hidden. See if you can find it. Let's
Ooh.
I'll leave it to you. I'll leave it to the viewers to see if they can figure it out. But it's subtle. It's not 100%, but he's definitely kind of. I definitely went to a few resources to. What's Tony look like? Yeah, okay, we're gonna make sure I capture him as complimentary as possible. But so he's in there. He's in there.
In fact, what you were just mentioning some comic elements there, and I think you know, there's some, and I mean this in a fantastic way. It kind of reminds me a little bit of Monty Python, actually, some of the comic elements in there.
I will take that as a compliment.
Terry Gilliam. I mean, like, it's no surprise. Terry Gilliam's work is very kind of cut out, and a lot of the medieval manuscripts have that same kind of look. Even with Time Team, one of the directors, Nick Gilliam-Smith, was doing a show, and he said to me, Neil, can you do a Monty Python type graphic? It was, I think, something to do with Lincolnshire Cathedral, I think, or something like that. And it was these monks being sort of led away with carrots on sticks, and it was kind of, but it was, and then once they went into this kind of cathedral, then I had, like, you know, God come up, and you know, the monks had wings sprouting or something like that. So like, it's definitely there. There's something about medieval work that is Terry Gilliam-esque, or vice versa. You know, maybe he's drawing from that, I don't know, but it sort of feels that way. So yeah, I mean, everything's kind of in profile a lot of the time, or at least 3/4. You'll never have a character, like in medieval illustrations, it's very rare to have a character look directly at the camera or the viewer. It's so that's it's kind of like it's a little bit like hieroglyphics as well. A lot of the characters were very kind of side on, or Greek kind of illustrations on pottery were very side on. So you get that. It's kind of interesting. So you just got to be mindful of that, because I can't. It's hard to draw something in the wrong way. I think there are only a few times where someone looks to camera, and then it's kind of, I remember thinking like, oh, well, how would that look? Because just the artwork doesn't lend itself to that. Where do I put the nose? Do I do a straight line for the nose, or do I just do a line down here for the under the nose? Because that's more of a modern way to kind of do noses, because as you kind of look to the camera, you get foreshortening, and there's lots of these things going on in your head. So that's why often you'll get them looking to the side. It's kind of interesting. Lots of things to think about drawing wise, and also perspectives can be kind of on kind of wonky perspective, and sometimes drawing things deliberately, or not worrying that if I've gone a little bit wobbly with my drawing, embracing it rather than kind of trying to get it to look anatomically correct, because that's a lot of that artwork is kind of a whole range of amateur to quite professional, talented to non-talented. Like if you look at the Luttrell Salter kind of manuscripts with like their fantasy characters, they're painted really lovely, but the kind of proportions are really weird, and it doesn't look like it was like a great artist, but they were great in their own way. But it's quite interesting, and so to try and capture that in some of the artwork.
Well, I particularly like the one we were talking about, Peter Abelard, on page 92, but the one of the monks kind of flee in the pub. You just mentioned the drunken monk pub. I just think that's so funny. Yeah.
It's kind of, it does make it a little bit more like we could be really serious with a lot of the illustrations, but sometimes having a bit of a license to play around with them and make them do things that they wouldn't normally do, or maybe they kind of would in some manuscripts. You have quite graphic or phallic or lots of weird stuff in it, so we're able to kind of speak to that, I guess.
Fantastic. And I noticed that you have dedicated the book to Victor Ambrose.
Yes. Well, I mean, like a huge influence, just to be to see him work in the field, to see his encyclopedic kind of illustrative knowledge on full display. It was very, very inspirational. I mean, I would often, even though I enjoy doing motion graphics, but I would be looking at thinking like Victor has the best job in the world, so I want to do that. And this book allows me to kind of do that. So it's nice to be able to kind of give a nod to Victor and kind of thank him for. I mean, I never got a chance to really sort of thank him in this kind of way. It's almost like having a grandparent that you get to a certain age, and once they've passed away, you can't tell them, oh, you had this kind of profound effect and thank you. So like at least I can put this in the book, and everyone can actually just see what a great artist he was, and I can just mention that and just give a nod to him. Brilliant.
No, that's fantastic to do. I really enjoyed this book. I think it's fantastic in that there's 1,000 years worth of history in here. It's entertaining, it's not dull, it explains the main points that you need to get about the Middle Ages or the medieval period. I think it's so well written. I think it's funny, it's entertaining. You can pick it up and you can dip in and out of it, and I just flick through. Every single page is illustrated. It's fantastic. It really is a fantastic book. And from my perspective, from a kind of outreach community archaeologist kind of perspective, I think it's fantastic. And then it really gets across the message. It makes it easy to read. It's easy to understand. It kind of takes you by the hand and takes you through the Middle Ages, all the way from the post-Roman period right through up into the 1500s. So thank you both, Neil and Eleanor, for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having us. It's such a pleasure to come and gush about it, I guess.
Yeah, thank you, Danny. It's so much fun. We should take you around with us wherever we go.
Yeah, we need her as a hype woman. It's gonna be
for sure.
Thank you so much. I think the book is going to do so well. So many people are going to be interested in this. So good luck with it, and hopefully we can catch up another time pretty soon.
Thank you, Danny.
Thanks, Danny.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks so much.